everybody, I'm back for chapter one. You're gonna hear me kind of go off and on because again, I'm doing this like per chapter just because of the way that I have to record this on my iPad. So we're just gonna start on chapter one, and first she begins kind of again. She just starts off with care ethics as a whole and kind of the increasing um, positive impact that it's having, as well as the interest that it's creating for like scholars and for those in philosophy, ethics, care, all that fun stuff. So she just kind of makes the point that scholars are increasingly making an effort to integrate the moral philosophy of care ethics with analysis of care work and social policy. We're going to get into a lot of that care work here in a minute. But it has little popularity in the international world, which is definitely where, her aim is right now. Like she's trying to make a goal to implement this idea of moral and political and philosophical thinking, excuse me. So feminists are seeking not to transfer care from homes to states, but rather to deconstruct the gendered dichotomies that we have created in public and private spheres as to two separate realms of human existence. So she always still wants to make a note in that implementation of care ethics and security studies or protection or whatever it may be, that we need to make the differentiation of the gender dichotomies that are happening there and how they affect and impact those institutions, systems, governments, families, whatever it may be. Um, while the need for care is universal, a feminist ethics of care is not a universalistic ethics in the traditional sense. It is an ethics of particularism and that rejects the claim that the highest stage of moral learning is characterized by disinterest and non-interference. And again, I mean, that just kind of talks about what I had just mentioned earlier, except that she wants to make the differentiation that while everybody understands that like care is a need, like that's a universal understanding, feminist ethics of care is not currently like a universal, I wouldn't say understanding, but like promotion or like no, universally that's not being advocated for. So she just makes that differentiation. And then we kind of get into care work and labor, and we're going to talk about this throughout the presentations. But what does that mean and what that kind of entails? But it essentially means like recognizing care as a kind of work has important implications for our understandings of labor, value, globalization, and even the economy itself. It also has massive transformative implications, and that it challenges gender roles, long lasting assumptions about the role of social policy and the welfare state. And it's, so essentially, obviously, we can kind of determine what care work slash care labor would be. Just to throw a few, examples out there, would obviously be like teaching, child care, being a nanny, even arguably like being a chef, things like that. And we can get more into that. We're going to talk about women work, quote unquote. Obviously, that looks a little bit different, but we're going to kind of get into those and how gender roles kind of play into those, because it's not often that you see a male nanny or a cis nanny, a cis male nanny, and we can kind of get into that. And then she said, in spite of the high demand for care work, it remains undervalued, under resourced, and under, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that word, under remunerated. I don't know. I had never seen this word before. I had to look it up in most societies. So essentially, obviously, if we think of childcare, if we think of teaching, if we think of nannies, like oftentimes these are people who have to take care of, younger people. And that takes a lot of work, especially like teaching, because not only are you pretty much babysitting them, but you're also like teaching them something, and you're like having to reinforce this like learning aspect and like actions and things like that, and kind of what that means. And so obviously we are underpaying teachers as it is today. And she just kind of, and despite like the demand that that holds, like obviously we constantly need teachers, like constantly, and we need to be teaching young people how to learn, and that way they can, get a life going. I don't know how else I guess to describe that. Furthermore, she kind of gives these idea of care principles, which she kind of holds throughout the rest of her book, but she describes it as attentiveness, responsibility, nurturance, compassion, and meeting others' needs. And this is kind of where my first question comes in today. So what like principles could be added to that list? And what stands out to you most? Finally, are there any principles that like you feel like maybe she's missing? Obviously, she's probably trying to keep this like, somewhat clear and concise, but like what do you feel like could be added or omitted from this list. And then furthermore, we get into kind of gendered associations, and we're going to kind of hold this obviously masculine versus feminine feel throughout the entire novel here. But she gets into violence. While certain types of violences are gendered masculine and associated with conventional security studies, feminists have taught us the violence must be understood as a continuum that includes both intimate violence and a militarized violence sectioned by states and international organizations. I was like very wordy sentence, but it essentially is, trying to say that we can't take violence and like differentiate it based on like gender either roles or like ideas of masculine versus feminine. Um, so obviously there are differences there, and we need to like be aware of both of them. But right now, I feel like a lot of times when we think of violence, like we don't think of those like intimate violences, especially like when we get into like sexual violence, etc., and how that affects like women versus men. And this idea of like describing one as masculine versus feminine is like really interesting, and we can kind of get into that. She furthermore introduces the idea of the autonomous man, and I'll be talking about that throughout the book. She brings it up like multiple times and kind of what that means. But in this case, I kind of want to like offer it to y'all and like ask who this is to you and what it means in your own words. This autonomous man. Obviously, it's like this, I feel like, very generic idea of like a I'm assuming cis het white man, those who benefit the most from current day society. Um, but also this idea of like autonomous man as like this person who thinks that they can be separated from everything else or like doesn't benefit from an ethics of care. And traditionally that is like, the cis het white man. And we can get into that. But just in your case, like who is this to you and how would you describe it? Furthermore, care ethics is not a feminine or a women's morality. She kind of wants to make that differentiation. Like, I think a lot of people would see it as that, but care ethics is like something that impacts and like benefits everybody. Um, while it does not reflect on the neglected values of care, it is not idealized caring nor assume the only women can or should care. On the contrary, it presents responsibilities and practices of care as the substance of morality and argues that the prevalence of women in widely undervalued caring positions as a social construction rather than a natural feature of femininity to ensure flourishing of all persons. So, like at this point in time, I think when we think of care ethics, like we think of how women are probably more concerned with it and want to implement it maybe more so than the average cis male, and we can get into that, but like but she wants to emphasize that this is like not a feminine versus masculine or a man versus women morality. Like this is an everyone morality, and it attributes to like the flourishing of all persons, and I know we talked about that earlier. um and finally, like as a final kind of note, like it's not feminine and it's not private, and we talked about it in the beginning, and it's problematic to think of it as either of those ways, or at least that's this seems she wants to argue, and maybe that's something that we can talk about whether you think that is problematic or it's not. But I think it definitely brings up some pivotal points, that it needs to be like a universal thinking and that it attributes to everybody and it's not limited to one or the other.